As the latter half of the 1970s passed, the country started undergoing a drastic change that shaped it going forward. Let's take the war in Vietnam, for instance. See, in 1975, the war finally turned a tide with the siege of Saigon, a very important city in the country. This would be followed by what is now known as the biggest helicopter evacuation in history, Operation Freaking Wind. So, what was this evacuation for? Well, it was for many military personnel and troops in the battle zone. In other words, the war in Vietnam was over. This mission was executed under the administration of President Gerald Ford. He would take over for President Nixon after his resignation, of course. Now, with all this done under his wing, you would think it was enough to have the general public in his graces. Let's face it, the Vietnam War wasn't a conflict that most Americans were behind, especially the younger generation who were constantly protesting against it in the first place. But when election time in 1976 came around, Americans had made a decision on whom they wanted to lead the nation. And it would be none other than James Earl Carter Jr., but better known as Jimmy Carter. That's right, Ford would not become a full-term president. The country had wanted to move on, and having the remnants of the old regime wasn't going to cut it anymore. Besides, pardoning Nixon after a huge scandal like Watergate certainly didn't help his cause. As for Jimmy Carter, he would become the epitome of the new direction that America was going in. Aside from being a naval veteran like Ford was, Carter had a different approach to leading the country. Carter had a very lenient stance on diplomatic and domestic matters, such as combating mass unemployment and creating the Department of Energy and Education. And he did something super noble. He made right by those who dodged the draft by pardoning them. He was also an advocate for the civil rights movement at one point. Speaking of the civil rights movement, the nation started to change in every aspect under his administration. For instance, things would turn out better for African Americans in America. They were making great strides in the public from the success they had with the movement. Let's take Shirley Chisholm. She had continued to do the great works she had started in the early 70s. But in the latter half of the 1970s, she would serve as the secretary of the Democratic Caucus and form the Congressional Women's Caucus in the process. Even Black History Month would be passed into law in 1976. Women's rights also gained a foothold, as well as the movement, which would be a huge victory. Technology also started becoming the focal point in homes across the country as home computers made their ways to shelves, with the Commodore PET and its competitor that would become a huge deal around this time, the Apple II. Yes, a creation from the minds of Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, who would later go on to greatness, especially Steve Jobs, of course. But things weren't all pleasant. In 1977, the world would lose a rock icon that was just as important to his generation as the Beatles were. The man I speak of is none other than the media-proclaimed king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley, who mysteriously passed away in his Memphis estate at the age of 42. But as they say, out with the old and in with the new. That would come in the form of a young man who had already made waves in music 6 years previously in 1973. Now he was grown up and ready to show the world what he had. That man was none other than Michael Jackson, who would come out with his debut album Off the Wall in 1979. Now, if you thought he was a breakout star in the Jackson 5, this was a whole different ballgame. Spearheaded with the singles Rock With You and Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, the album debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 100 and number 1 on the Billboard Top Black Albums. Not a particularly good name convention, Billboard. Not at all. Great job on renaming that. Anyway, the album was a byproduct of a music movement that started earlier in the decade. disco. But unfortunately, disco would actually start to die off, but a new genre would take pieces of it and make something truly unique. Something that would truly reflect on Black lives living in urban areas and became a byproduct of it. That being none other than hip-hop. But truthfully, that's more in the realm of the 80s. We will get into that next time, of course. As for television, shows like Charlie's Angels would start to showcase females in a way that wasn't seen before. Charlie's Angels had an all-female cast, one of which was the premier starlet of that decade. Farrah Fawcett Majors, by the way. They were a trio of female private investigators getting into sticky situations with action. Situations that were usually reserved for male characters. The show would be an instant hit on ABC. Television would also get shows like Dallas, which revolved around an oil tycoon and his family in Texas. It showcased storylines that involved scandalous situations, to say the least. Even edgier than Dallas was Knots Landing, which would make its way to NBC. This series showcased storylines involving kidnappings, promiscuity, criminal investigations, and anything of the like. These two primetime soap operas, as they were coined, were the sign of the times. The sitcoms were also getting edgier with their humor. Shows like All in the Family and The Jeffersons were still on air around this time, but others would emerge and make a dent in the primetime landscape. Let's take Welcome Back, Kotter, for example. This would be a sitcom about a teacher in the city school system dealing with a group of ruffians as students, the Sweat Hogs. One of them was a young John Travolta, who would become a bigger star with his starring role in Saturday Night Fever during the sitcom's run. Then you had Different Strokes, which would star a 1970s sitcom alum, Conrad Bain, who takes a backseat to two African-American upstarts in Todd Bridges and the kid who would go on to coin one of the greatest catchphrases ever in television history.
What you talking about, Willis?
Gary Coleman indeed. As for the premise, it was about two black kids from the other side of the tracks being adopted by a wealthy white man after his housekeeper dies. The idea of a blended family of this caliber was almost unheard of on television at the time. But here it was, front and center. Then audiences would get Three's Company, which starred John Ritter as Jack Tripper, a man who surprisingly stumbles upon a living situation with two female roommates, Janet Wood and Chrissy Snow, who was played by another blonde starlet that would make waves around this time, Suzanne Summers. This was all while keeping Jack under the radar of their landlords, the Ropers. This sitcom would have a lot of tongue-in-cheek innuendos. Seeing that kind of relationship the trio had wasn't seen on TV prior. There was a time on television when even a married couple wasn't even shown in their bedroom, let alone sleeping in the same bed. Now, you had a man and two women coexisting in the same apartment. Things had really changed on TV. But once again, this was primetime television. So, what was going on with Saturday morning programming around this time? Well, the networks would start to have a very difficult time appeasing the people who were really down their throats. In other words, getting the PTA, the ACT, and other watchdog groups off their backs. They would pull this off by hiring more expert advisors to supervise the content being brought to their lineups, especially CBS. They would also start bringing content that would appease the parents of America and the watchdog groups. But there was one slight problem with that. They weren't successful. Kids weren't gravitating to these new efforts from the networks. Let's try to think as we did as kids growing up. As a kid, you most likely hated going to school every day. Now, having shows that fully leaned on education wasn't the kind of content that was entirely suitable for Saturday morning lineups, due to most kids just wanting to get away from the trappings of a classroom. Of course, this is just a theory, even though their efforts were heavily discouraging for the networks. to a point where they really wanted to get rid of Saturday morning programming altogether. On top of that, ad revenue was dropping to an all-time low during the latter half of the 1970s. To make matters worse, a new group would be formed to police advertising during Saturday morning programming, the Children's Television Task Force, created by the undeniable ones themselves, the FTC. Also, a new form of entertainment would start grabbing children's attention collectively. I speak of none other than video games. Once regulated only to arcades, video game consoles would finally start making their appearance in households across America with the release of the Fairchild Channel F in 1976. But it would be the release of the Atari 2600 in 1977 that would truly hit it off big, to an overwhelming degree. Every kid had to have one in their living room. So it's easy to say that the competition of capturing the young audience had gotten harder for the networks. But that would be the least of their problems. As we will see, the networks weren't getting as much content as they had previously gotten. So they would start the practice of repackaging older cartoons as far as back as the early 60s, creating shows as double features and leaning heavily on live action shows as well. For instance, let's look at NBC around this time. Hanna-Barbera would continue their reign on Saturday mornings during the latter half of the 70s, along with their competitor Filmation as well. Even DePatie Freeling Enterprises had something to offer on the lineup. Speaking of them, they would bring something they weren't quite known for doing themselves: an insurance policy. Mind you, this was the studio still riding on the success of the Pink Panther show and its various incarnations that would be on air around this time. So they were trying to make a new mark on the networks. And they would, with something that was quite odd even for Saturday mornings.
Who's the hobo everyone knows, and who's the superhero superly slow?
Here it is, DePatie Freeling Enterprises entry into insurance policy territory. Baggy pants and the nitwits. DePatie Freeling was coming off the failures of the Barkleys and the Houndcats, but the network was in dire need of new content due to the pressure they were under themselves. The studio gave them something unique. Now, at first glance, you might not think that it's an insurance policy, but in truth, it really is. See, the character was based on none other than Charlie Chaplin. To be specific, the Tramp. Considering that Chaplin shorts didn't make the transition to television well, and several TV stations hesitant on showing them due to his stance on politics at the time, Baggy Pants was his real shot at finding a true audience, as anthropomorphic cat. As with the shorts, Baggy Pants got into mischief by happenstance. Being the drifter that he was in the shorts, the cartoon emulated the feel of the films as the cartoon was silent. He even had the signature cane and top hat as well. Whereas Baggy Pants maintained the feel of the shorts, the other segment would deviate from that entirely. They were the Nitwits, a not-so-super couple, which was Tyrone, a retired superhero with a cane, and his wife, Gladys. Yes, a superhero. As we know by now, the superhero purge of the late 60s had taken place across the networks. Going forward, you will see that this wasn't entirely the case. Tyrone himself can be seen as a statement of the resurgence of superheroes. But unfortunately, the Nitwits didn't fit that bill. Their superheroics leaned heavily on comedic effect.
Is he well?
He's all right. He's just sensitive.
They went out and defended the city and planet against the evildoers for the people who had wanted them to do so, and as a part-time job found in a newspaper ad. Guess superheroism pays really well. Despite the effort that DePatie Freeling had put into Baggy Pants and the Nitwits, it failed to capture an audience. It most likely had to do with kids not really knowing Charlie Chaplin's shorts that well. Either way, Charlie Chaplin's shot at cartoon stardom had came to an end. As for Filmation, they would give the network an interesting creation for its lineup. Lo and behold, The Secret Lives of Waldo Kitty. So, what would this one be about? Well, for one, Waldo and his girlfriend had to contend with Tyrone, the neighborhood dog, who was quite the bully. Well, that was the premise of the live-action segment. Yeah, that's right. Waldo Kitty was partly created with live pets. As you can imagine, this would be quite a pain to pull off. And that it was. Supposedly, the production crew always had to chase the pets around so they could stay still to shoot their scenes. Cats and dogs aren't really known for being camera smart. Well, except for Lassie. Gotta love that collie, right? Anyway, just like Archie's Funhouse, the cartoon would play a part after the segment as Waldo's imagination went wild. In reality, he was just a regular scared cat who couldn't defend himself. But in his imagination, he was quite heroic. He was Tarzan, Catman, Robin Hood, and the Lone Kitty. Of course, these were parodies of famous fantasy heroes. All of them were brave, and he turned to them so he could fend off Tyrone and his squad of ruffian dogs. Unfortunately, during its run, the episode order was shortened to 13 episodes when it was originally 16. On top of that, one of the layout artists by the name of Lorna Hill threatened to sue Filmation. This was due to the studio not giving her credit for the idea she had turned in for them. They were perplexed by it since she had already had worked there. Besides, it wasn't her idea originally, as she actually based it off James Thurber's classic book, The Secret Lives of Walter Mitty. None of this turmoil would even matter because the series was a failure for the studio, as it only ever got that initial 13 episodes, and that was it. So much that it never even got reruns on the network. That was it. Filmation wanted to distance itself from it, and maybe this was the right move, considering that even the James Thurber estate was also on their backs over the character as well. Waldo Kitty, we never knew you. The studio would also bring something that they felt would garner tons of fanfare. Something that was quite familiar to the audience. Let me introduce you all to...
Hold on to your seats, kids. Here we go.
The fabulous funny.
Like a brand new day, we're here again, spreading sunshine to everyone. We've rounded up all our friends for you. I'm Elliot with a joke or two.
The fabulous funny.
Here it is. Fabulous Funnies. Now, it may look quite familiar to you. This is for good reason. This would be another attempt at what they did with Archie's TV Funnies. The primetime special that aired on the network prior gave the studio the green light to give it another shot. But Archie and the gang were not along for the ride with this outing. As before, Fabulous Funnies were various comic strips brought to animation. Many of the characters returned, such as Emmy Lou, Broomhilda, and Captain and the Kids, or as I once referred to them as, the Catching Jammer Kids. Okay. And you got new strips such as Alley Oop and Tumbleweeds. These animated representations would mostly be the same as they were in Archie's TV Funnies, but Filmation decided that it should have more of an educational angle. Despite the series winning awards for 2 episodes, Fabulous Funnies didn't last past its 13-episode run. In fact, it didn't even get as much as a rerun. Too bad, considering the man behind getting it on the air itself. It would be a huge disappointment. Filmation also came with another offering, an exciting one. Super Witch. It was Sabrina again, in more adventures. From Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Yeah, Super Witch was just a repackaging of those episodes as a mid-season replacement for the new Archie Sabrina Hour. Okay, I'm very sorry for that detour. The real and true exciting addition from Filmation to NBC's lineup would be something truly great.
These teenage guardians form the greatest team the world has ever known, the Space Sentinels.
Filmation's offering for the network an attempt to capitalize off the success of Star Wars. It would share similarities to the film, such as the use of space technology. In this cartoon, we have 3 individuals from different cultures being transported from their respective places, given powers by a sentient being called Sentinel-1, then brought back to Earth with a ship. Their mission? Defend Earth from all kinds of evil. Our heroes would be quite the trio. First, there was Hercules, blonde and muscular with the combined strength of 100 men. Then there was Mercury, an Asian athletic man who could run so fast he would give the Flash and Superman a run for their money. And lastly, we have Astrea. Yes, a black woman, beautiful and strong, with the ability to turn into various animal creatures anytime she needed to. And to top it off, she was the leader of the trio. Told you she was strong. They were joined by their robotic companion, M.O. Guess whom it looked like? Anyway, Filmation definitely wore their influence on their sleeves for this one. Space Sentinels was very unusual for a cartoon at the time, but this was the studio that introduced the children of America to Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, so Filmation was eager to make strides in that regard. The cartoon had also gotten the extra treatment that showcased the prowess of the talent at the studio. In other words, you weren't mistaking this for Archie at first glance. Unfortunately, their efforts into the superhero genre wouldn't bode so well on the network. It would only last for 13 episodes. Notice I said on the network. Well, that's for good reason. See, Hercules would go off and join another team on adventures on another network. Which one? Well, stay tuned, of course. The networks really need more viewership for their lineups, particularly NBC. They would conjure up something unthinkable to showcase. This offering had not only the backing of a very well-known celebrity, but also his likeness at the forefront. So what came next would be unlike anything seen before it. So, what was it? Well, just take a look at this.
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
That's right, the heavyweight champion of the world. A man considered to be possibly the greatest heavyweight champion of all time, and someone that influenced many others to become either great themselves or champions, such as Mike Tyson. Around the time this series premiered, he was fresh off his title defense against Alfredo Evangelista and would go on to face Ernie Shavers, whom Ali called the hardest puncher he has ever faced. Despite that, he came out as the victor of both bouts. He was riding high off his successful wins, and also the reception of his dramatized autobiographical film, The Greatest, which chronicled his rise in boxing and his life up to that point. The film would gain major acclaim from many who had seen it. This was a man who stood by his convictions, the same man who refused to be drafted to the war in Vietnam, but somehow came out of it almost unscathed. That was Muhammad Ali. So, When a lesser-known studio by the name of Farmhouse Films wanted to make something special with him in it, Ali wasn't a man to back down and refuse an offer like this. So, how did Farmhouse Films transfer his charm and charisma to the realm of animation? Well, this version of Muhammad Ali would be quite different from what he really was. For instance, Ali went on adventures and solved mysteries with his nephew and niece. He even managed to travel to Africa, met to even punching alligators, all while imparting wisdom upon the viewer and the kids. This was definitely Ahmad Ali. With a man like Ali, success seemed certain. But that was the boxing world. On Saturday mornings, unfortunately, he didn't fare well. The series would only get 13 episodes on the network. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. Because at the end of the day, that was Muhammad Ali. And his contribution to the world of animation is now immortalized. Thank you, Ali. Thank you.
Jogging, boxing, it keeps me ready, but it's getting a lot of rest. Eating good food and exercises and doing it every day. You know, physical fitness is not just something you do 3 times a week in a gym class. You must have the right attitude. You must concentrate, keep your body in condition so that your body can take care of you. Now I know what I'm talking about. Look at me.
As for Hanna-Barbera, they would continue their reign on Saturday mornings. They had many to offer to NBC and the kids of America. First up the bat was CB Bears. Here, kids would get to see the misadventures of 3 anthropomorphic bears by the name of Boogie, Hustle, and Bump, who just happened to be detectives. Even though the series was called CB Bears, it was a show that consisted of several segments. This would be their attempt to fill the lineup with as many cartoons as they could to appease the network. So the idea? Give kids an hour-long show to keep them engaged. The series would be comprised of segments such as Blast Off Buzzard, which was Hanna-Barbera's attempt to create a competitor to the Roadrunner and Coyote shorts. Since around this time, the Looney Tunes shorts were a huge commodity. But this time, it was a buzzard and a snake. And of course, non-violent. This was the late 70s after all. Then there was, Hey, it's the King. Seriously, that's the name of the segment. Anyway, this one was about a cool line named the King. Upon first glance, you can tell where the influence of the character came from. In case if you don't know, let me enlighten you. See, around this time, a classic sitcom would be on its 3rd season, ABC. The sitcom that I speak of is Happy Days, and that cool character was Arthur Fonzarelli, or mostly known as the Fonz. Ironically, his catchphrase was, "Hey!" So it's easy to say that Hanna-Barbera employed their impressive skills at borrowing ideas. At least the King would have his companions to join him along for the ride, such as Big H, Sheena, Yuka Yuka, Skids, and Zelda. They navigate through the tough times of being in high school in a span of fewer than 10 minutes. Quite an achievement. Next, there was Posse Impossible, which was a wacky take on Western shows and the like. This one starred a sheriff and his posse of cowboys, Big Stick, Big Duke, and Blubber. They were in charge of governing the town of Saddle Sore. Speaking of impossible, one of the segments would borrow from Mission Impossible. The same approach that Patty Freeling would employ with the Houndcats. But here, Hanna-Barbera's take would be called Undercover Elephant. In this one, we have the titular character and his sidekick who happens to be a mouse by the name of Loudmouse. Quite the name indeed. They worked together for an agency called Central Control and solved mysteries wherever they went. And lastly, there was Shake, Rattle, and Roll. In this one, 3 ghosts haunted and ran an inn for other monsters to reside. They also managed to get into hijinks in between and play instruments. Unfortunately, CB Bears would only get 13-episode run on the network, but their real success would come from syndicated reruns. This isn't the only cartoon from the studio that had bears as their main characters. This second one would make its way back to his place on NBC's Saturday morning lineup.
Strato blasting in from deep space, racing through distant galaxies. It's Space.
Here it is, Yogi's Space Race. Starring that lovable picnic, basket-snatching, tie-wearing bear himself, Yogi Bear, alongside, See, in this one, Boo Boo wouldn't go along for the ride in this outing. Instead, audiences would get Scare Bear, who was as his name implied. This would be Yogi's return from his short-lived tenure on Saturday mornings previously. For an hour, on Saturday mornings no less. This time around, Yogi and his friends would participate in another activity, racing in space. Hanna-Barbera dove into their bag of ideas for this one. In other words, this was another version of Wacky Races, which had proven successful for them on CBS many years prior. But this wouldn't be entirely accurate. As you can tell from the font of the title, the influence is quite clear. This would be influenced by none other than Star Wars. Let's take it in the context of 1977-1978. Star Wars would hit the box office and become an overnight success. It would gross $550 million during its initial theatrical run. Soon, comic books and merchandise came after it. Star Wars would also win a whopping 7 Academy Awards that following year. So copying something as popular as Star Wars was mostly inevitable. In Yogi's case, the influence would come in form of the races themselves, as they raced in several spacecraft while contending with the likes of Queen Medusa and Captain Good, who was also a phantom thing with the press of a button. Instant split personality. Well, at least Yogi had help from his old friend Huckleberry Hound, but the cartoon would also introduce audiences to several new characters to the fold. Even with all these elements thrown in for good measure, Yogi's Space Race wasn't the big success that the network had wanted. It wasn't resonating with the audience, but Hanna-Barbera wouldn't give up on it just yet. See, Hanna-Barbera had made a bold move on behalf of the network, split the segments up and give them their own cartoon series. First up, they brought out the Buford Files. Besides the title being a play on the detective hit show, The Rockford Files, that was still on air around this time, Buford was a droopy-eyed bloodhound living fictionalized Louisiana-style town, contending with the likes of Sheriff Dupes and Deputy Goofer, as he helped to solve mysteries with his friends Cindy May and Woody. As you can imagine, this was Hanna-Barbera's one of many attempts to capitalize off the success of Scooby-Doo, which migrated over to ABC around this time. Well, at least Scooby-Doo did have a pet raccoon who did karate as a rival, so take that, Scooby. Anyway, Buford Files would also be paired with another cartoon called The Galloping Ghost in 1979, in an attempt to salvage both cartoons from the chopping block. As for The Galloping Ghost, this one centered on a ghost of an old man who used to be a gold prospector, and he could sniff it out with his nose. His name, Nugget Nose, of course. And also, of course, in true Hanna-Barbera fashion, he had companions, Wendy and Rita, 2 cowgirls who worked at the Fuddy Dude Ranch for a mean boss and the owner of the ranch. But with the rub of Rita's gold necklace, Nugget Nose would be summoned and become helpful with getting Fuddy off their backs. And if that wasn't enough for the young audience, they would take another segment from Yogi's Space Race, something more connected to the main cartoon than the rest of them. Here it is. I present to you Galaxy Goof-Offs. When Yogi Bear, Scare Bear, Quack Up, and Huckleberry Hound weren't participating in the races, they had side jobs, working as space officers. Just imagine them just patrolling about in the galaxy to keep the peace. And that's what you would imagine it would be. It's in the title, for goodness sake. These four did a lot of goofing off, but under the guidance of Captain Snurley, well, as much as he could. He was too busy trying to get his higher-up General Blowhard off his back. But no matter how inept they were, they always seemed to manage to get the job done in the end. In all, Yogi's Space Race and its subsequent spin-offs would be gone from the airways by 1979. Unsurprisingly, they weren't Hanna-Barbera's only offerings on the network, not by a long shot. They would make another effort to give the young audience something fresh, something that the children of America were going to clamor for, or so they banked on. A cartoon that was predestined to fit like a glove on any of the Big Three's Saturday morning lineups. But in 1978, it would be NBC that had gotten the luck of the draw. So, what was it? Well, without further ado.
Up from the depths, 30 stories high, breathing fire, his head in the sky, Godzilla.
The gigantic green super lizard that kids absolutely adored and clamored to watch on a Saturday afternoon. Godzilla. Or, as the Japanese would call him, Gojira. Making its way to Japanese audiences in 1954, Godzilla would make huge waves at the box office as it told the story of nuclear bomb experiments that decimated an island and a group of scientists that were sent to investigate the incident. This, of course, reflected Japan's own experience with the U.S. atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 9 years prior. But unlike that real-life event that just decimated thousands, this bombing unearthed an ancient monster that had slept dormant under the earth for millions of years. Now it was alive. Now it was alive to wreak havoc upon all of Japan. Thus, a star was born. And a star it was. Godzilla would go on to earn 152 million yen at the box office on opening day and earn much acclaim. This prompted Toho Company to quickly make a sequel, but the original director, Ishiro Honda, was already off making another movie. So they got Motoyoshi Oda, who had previously done Lady from Hell in 1946. Gojira no Gyakushu, translated to Godzilla's Counterattack, but known in the U.S. as Godzilla Raids Again, was released on April 24, 1955, to moderate success. Despite Godzilla's Raids Again not being as successful as the first film was, Toho knew they had something and went on to create a new genre in Japanese film, Kaiju Eiga. They would also be credited for birthing tokusatsu, which was a genre of film that employed live action with very heavy practical effects. Think of Ultraman. Anyway, Godzilla would be riding high off its various installments as it went from being Japan's worst nightmare to being Earth's biggest defender. This period of films is known today as the Showa era. These films had it facing off against adversaries such as Hedorah, King Kong, yes, that King Kong, Gigan, Ibara, and even a robot version of Godzilla called Mechagodzilla. When the movies hit American shores, they soared in popularity and were huge winners at the box office. So when the late 70s came around, particularly in 1978, the Godzilla movies had laid dormant. So with Toho's permission and Henry G. Saperstein at the helm, who was responsible for all of the Godzilla films reaching American shores in the first place, Hanna-Barbera set forth to bring the all-powerful kaiju back to screens. So what would Henry G. Saperstein and Hanna-Barbera conjure up? Well, the premise for the series was about a group of scientists and their young assistants going on expeditions to different locations around the world. But for some reason, they always happened to end up incurring the wrath of various monsters, such as the stone creature, breeder beast, and the great watchdog. So to save them, they would summon the super lizard itself, Godzilla. But this version of Godzilla was quite different. First, it didn't resemble his depiction in the movies. Instead, it resembled a T-Rex.
Second, Godzilla only breathed fire to ward off his adversaries. None of its other powers were present in the series.
But the series' biggest addition, great or not so great, would come in the form of Godzuki, Godzilla's nephew. Whereas Godzilla was his imposing self, Godzuki was a 10-foot-tall version of the titular kaiju, but it was very playful and got into antics with the younger companions. Despite these changes to the character and toned-down content, Godzilla the Anime series had proven to be a great addition to NBC's Saturday morning lineup. So much that it got top billing as the Godzilla Power Hour. Of course, this means that it was another pairing of shows. Well, technically, it would be only one creation. Lo and behold, I present to you
Montaro, Tico, and my jaguar ghost help me guard the jungle and those who dwell within it. I grew up by the laws of nature, and the animals of the jungle became my friends.
That's right, Hanna-Barbera's take on Tarzan, but with some added girl power. Janna of the jungle. In this series, Janna is raised in the jungle after she and her father are lost during a rafting expedition in the jungles of South America, presumably. There's just something about rafts that just get people lost in uncharted lands, I guess. Well, at least she grows up to become a beautiful lady and become the defender of the jungle. She has a mission in life, to find her long-lost father. Somewhere, considering from the intro, he is still alive. She is joined by Montaro, a warrior of the land, who raised her as his own daughter and taught her what she knows. Dr. Ben Cooper, who actually had ties to her father as he ran a nature reserve that her father had built. And of course, being a Saturday morning cartoon, she had animal companions. She was joined by Ghost, a very white jaguar, and Tico, a very cute water possum. Armed with her necklace that turned into a chakram, she would fight those who threatened the peace of the jungle and its inhabitants. Unfortunately, Janna would never find her father, as her adventure only really lasted that one season and just lived in rerun purgatory. Hopefully she's still out there and found what she was looking for. Brave warrior Janna. Unfortunately, around this time, the Godzilla Power Hour would go on a short hiatus, but it would make its return on December 4th, 1978. With a jump to 90 minutes in an effort to fill the lineup and redubbed Godzilla Super 90, as it would be paired with another segment. Remember when I said earlier that the studios started repackaging older cartoons as far as back as the early 60s? Well, here's an example of that, as this segment would be none other than Johnny Quest. This was what the networks had came to, trying to fill lineups just for the sake of it, since there were no restrictions on what could have been shown as new content, per se. That didn't work out, unsurprisingly, so as Godzilla Super 90 was shortened to 30 minutes for the remainder of the year. It seemed that Godzilla would go at it alone for its second season, but that wouldn't be the case. In the last attempt to salvage Godzilla on the network, they paired it with the Harlem Globetrotters, now redubbed the Godzilla Globetrotters Adventure Hour. This pairing would bleed into 1980, but the constant shuffling of shows befuddled young audiences, and Godzilla would see its last days during that year. All wouldn't be lost. Today, the entire second season, which was never released on any platform, can now be watched on Toho's very own YouTube channel. Talk about preservation done correctly. Nothing can keep our favorite kaiju down. With most of the segment turned anime series gone from the airways by 1979, NBC would be left in dire straits during that year, as it would showcase mostly reruns, not even repackaging several Daffy Duck cartoons such as The Daffy Duck Show, giving a very much recognizable character as Godzilla a cartoon, nor bringing back Fred and Barney in a last-ditch effort could salvage their lineup. NBC couldn't garner the same ratings they had done in the earlier part of the 70s. But whereas NBC didn't breed much success during the latter half of the 70s, this would be a different case at ABC. At ABC, they got lucky, very lucky. Remember when I previously mentioned about a man behind getting Fabulous Funnies on the air was a disappointment? Well, that was warranted, because that man was none other than Fred Silverman. That's right, the man with the golden gut himself. But this was in 1978, before he could get his magic touch on NBC. Or did he? Anyway, Fred Silverman would leave for ABC in 1975, where he first got his start as a mailroom clerk. Now he was back as the man, ready to helm ABC's struggling primetime lineup. So much of a struggle, they were a distant third. He went to work immediately, and he would be responsible for some of the greatest television shows of all time coming to the network, such as Bionic Woman, $6 Million Man, and the shows I mentioned in the beginning, Three's Company and Charlie's Angels, and one of the most important shows ever in the history of television, Roots. But that was primetime television. So, with his 3 years at ABC, what magic did he work on ABC's Saturday morning lineup? Well, for one, he had taken a huge chunk of CBS's Saturday morning prestige with him. In other words, Scooby-Doo went to ABC, and as discussed in the history of Hanna-Barbera, you know how that went. Go watch it, by the way. But what else would he be responsible for bringing to ABC's lineup? Well, truthfully, the network didn't offer much to the young audience, as they felt Scooby-Doo was enough to hold a lineup. And it actually did. But they would still have more to offer. After all, this was a Saturday morning lineup. First, they would bring back a duo that had graced theatrical screens with their greatness. And now, they were ready to make their debut on ABC's Saturday morning lineup on the strength of their names. You already know where I am going as soon as I mentioned a duo. But in case if you haven't realized, let me show you.
For a while, it's the Tom and Jerry Great 8 Show. Go get 'em! You begin with a grin when you first tune us in on the Tom and Jerry Great 8 Show. We got 'em!
Here it is, the cat and mouse duo that once dominated theater houses with their antics. A duo who would garner such acclaim and awards for their exploits. A duo that made Joe Barbera and William Hanna a force to be reckoned with, and made them realize that they could start their own studio and emulate that same success. Now, it was time to bring Tom and Jerry back in brand new cartoons for a Saturday morning audience with the new Tom and Jerry Show. This return would be a wise decision, considering that the MGM shorts were languishing in syndication around this time. So, with the blessing of MGM and the higher-ups at ABC, they were back again. But the new in the title had some major significance. See, whereas the content of the MGM shorts was mostly suitable for syndication due to those markets' flexibility with how they could present their television programming, the networks weren't usually afforded that luxury. This was the late 70s after all, so unfortunately, certain things had to be either changed or altered. First of all, Tom and Jerry weren't enemies in this iteration. Instead, they were very close friends who still got into chase scenarios for some reason. Guess cats and mice were just born to do that stuff. Speaking of the latter, Jerry now sported a red tie. Of course, this was due to Hanna-Barbera's frequent use of limited animation. This was a little trick they used with every character from Yogi Bear to Huckleberry Hound that allowed them to animate the head independently. With their collars, of course. Also, Tom and Jerry weren't involved in anything remotely harsh. Instead, they got into comedic situations that involved helping someone in need, working various jobs, facing off against villains, and the like. This would be a very drastic direction. And on top of that, they also paired it with another cartoon, as the series was actually called The New Tom and Jerry Grape Ape Show. As for Grape Ape, he was a gigantic purple ape that wore a cap. He got into antics as he and his anthropomorphic dog companion, Beetle Beagle, drove around cross-country in his vehicle. And how did Grape Ape get around? Using the vehicle as a skateboard, of course. Sounds wacky, doesn't it? And if that wasn't enough, the series would get a replacement cartoon after Hanna-Barbera separated Grape Ape and repackaged it as its own series. In its place would be Mumbly. This one had Hanna-Barbera rehashing their tried and true formula, copying some IP and making a show out of it. In this case, the show would be none other than Columbo. Starring the late Peter Falk, the show was a huge success on the network's primetime lineup. Actually, it wasn't a show per se. Instead, it was a series of made-for-TV movies. These involved Columbo trying to solve a case, but the format of the series was quite different from the average detective show at the time. Here, the viewing audience had already seen the perpetrator and the crime happen. It was up to Columbo to find the clues and make the perpetrator confess to the crime. But with Mumbly, there would be none of this going on. In fact, the series made sure you knew he wasn't very good at being a detective. Quite the conundrum. But for some odd reason, Mumbly always seemed to catch the villain, as they always thought that they would get away with the crime. Speaking of Mumbly, he may look familiar to those who watched a certain Hanna-Barbera cartoon. Now, if you said he looks just like Muttley from Wacky Races, then you would be absolutely correct. This wasn't a mere coincidence. See, Hanna-Barbera wanted to use the character for the show, but there was a slight problem. See, the characters of Dick Dastardly and Muttley were actually owned by Peter Quigley Productions. Around this time, they were already bought out by Filmways, a studio that already had its mark on television with shows such as Green Acres, The Beverly Hillbillies, and The Addams Family. So getting the rights to use Muttley would be quite a pain. So to circumvent the use of the character, they had to do something. The solution? They just changed the color of his fur and gave him a trench coat. Gotta love Hanna-Barbera. At least they gave Mumbly a jalopy of a car to drive. Maybe that wasn't a great thing. Unfortunately, the new Tom and Jerry show only lasted one season on ABC. Considering that MGM supposedly hated Hanna-Barbera's direction with the characters, maybe it was for the best. If it's any consolation, MGM did take these cartoons and threw them into a syndicated package, so all wasn't lost. And besides, this wouldn't be the last time Tom and Jerry would ever grace a Saturday morning lineup. In fact, this series was only the beginning of things to come. ABC still had some aces in its sleeves. They brought on another offering that would take the superhero genre
in another direction, a very, very different direction. In September of 1979, kids sat in front of their television screens to witness the exploits of
He can spring. He can stretch. He can fly. He can bounce. He can change his shape. And he can even dance.
Lo and behold, the Plastic Man Comedy Adventure Show, starring the unlikeliest of superheroes. From a studio started by two men that were instrumental in creating the most successful Saturday morning cartoon character of that decade. That character was Scooby-Doo, and these two men were Joseph Ruby and Kenneth Spears. Together, with the backing of Fred Silverman, they would form Ruby Spears Productions. Created out of necessity to spread more content on the network, Ruby and Spears were out to blaze a trail like their former bosses had done. The studio would premiere Fangface, a cartoon about a werewolf who hung out with three teenagers by the name of Buff, Kim, and Pugsy. And guess what they did for a living? Solving mysteries and nabbing the villain in the process, of course. In other words, this was Ruby Spears Productions' take on Scooby-Doo, and for good reason. See, this was all by design, due in part to Fred Silverman himself wanting a show that could supplement Scooby-Doo on the lineup. And it had paid off for Ruby Spears, as it would garner itself a second season on the network, which would only be possible due to Ruby Spears' flagship insurance policy. Oh, that's right. See, Plastic Man actually got his start on the pages of Police Comics in 1951, but DC would soon scoop up the publication, and thus Plastic Man became a DC Comics superhero. But calling Plastic Man a superhero would be quite a stretch. No pun intended. Formerly a criminal who got left behind by his friends after a botched robbery at a chemical factory and falling into a vat of chemicals, Patrick Eel O'Brien vowed to bring his so-called friends to justice after being endowed with super elastic powers. He became to be known as Plastic Man, a hero who always had a gag or a joke while exacting justice. In this series, Ruby Spears would capture that aspect. The cartoon was about our titular hero working for a secret agency bent on fighting crime across the globe, all led by his boss, the Chief, a long raven and gray-haired beauty who managed to capture the whims of Plastic Man. But he wouldn't go at these tasks alone. He had two sidekicks, Hula Hula, a pudgy East Asian man who seemed to always have bad luck wherever he went, and Penny, a blonde who had quite the crush on Plastic Man. Despite his constant goofing around, making him oblivious to it, the trio flew around and contended with the likes of the Clam, Carrot Man, Computer Head, and his number one nemesis, Dr. Dome. The network had put its faith in Plastic Man so much, the show had jumped to 120 minutes by the end of September 1979. Yes, a whopping 2 hours. That was unheard of on any of the network's lineups, but it was warranted. See, the networks distanced themselves away from anything violent at the time, and Plastic Man was the kind of character that fit the mold for the network's new initiative. In other words, non-violent and humorous, a winning combination. Of course, in true fashion, the Plastic Comedy Adventure Show was joined by other segments as well. First up, we have Mighty Man and Yuck. This one was quite odd, as it starred a tiny superhero that gave Inch-Eye Private Eye a run for his money, and his sidekick, Yuck, a dog that was so ugly it wore a doghouse on its head. But when in times of need, Yuck would take it off and scared the bejesus out of his adversaries, all to save the day as they both got into various misadventures. Next up, we have Rickety Rocket.
Scientific marvel.
Rickety Rocket! Blast off!
Whereas Mighty Man and Yuck dabbled in superheroics, this one was quite unique, as it had 4 African-American kids from the future who were all geniuses. So smart that they had built a sentient space rocket that flew and talked. They also managed to run their own detective agency in the process. We are introduced to Cosmo, the cool shades-wearing genius, the pudgy kid Splashdown, the loud color-wearing Sunstroke, and the resident female genius, Venus, making their mark in the futuristic world. I could imagine the reception for this particular cartoon amongst children of color, or even children in general. Unfortunately, those segments never received the same reception that Plastic Man had gotten. So when Plastic Man returned for second season, it came back here. Our hero had finally given Penny a shot, and they ended up having a baby named Baby Plas. Baby Plas was quite the unusual tyke. Endowed with the same powers as his father, they both got into mischief, alongside Hulu Hulu, of course. Was just a marginal success, enough to warrant the network to keep it on their lineup until 1981, later making a comeback in 1983. Plastic Man had quite the stretch, if I must say. Pun intended. With Hanna-Barbera and Ruby Spears Productions having their superhero offerings on the network, the Patty Freeling Enterprises decided they could also take a shot at it, straight from the pages of Marvel Comics no less. A cartoon that would be a reflection of that era. So, what was their offering for the network in collaboration with Marvel? Well, feast your eyes on this.
Look! Up on the building! It's Spider-Woman!
And this is Jessica Drew.
Here it is, the one and only Spider-Woman. This would be a creation of Archie Goldwyn and Marie Severin, who were at the height of their careers at Marvel Comics. Archie had created Power Man, but we know him today as Luke Cage. As for Marie, she was responsible for also co-creating Howard the Duck, and was very instrumental in Marvel Comics' success at the time. Both of them would premiere her in the issue of Marvel Spotlight number 32. The reception to Spider-Woman was great and had been proven to be a huge success for the publication. So, she was given her own series. Spider-Woman was a capable woman by the name of Jessica Drew, who had gotten her powers from getting injected with spider blood and incubated since her days as a child. But that was the comics. See, with Spider-Man having previous success on Saturday mornings, the Patty Freeling Enterprises and Stan Lee decided to alter her origin to match his in a way. Now, she was bitten by a poisonous spider, but to save her life, her father injected her with a spider serum that accidentally endowed her with powers. She shot webs from her fingers and hands. She also had the power to shoot venom blast, as she called it, from her wrist. Spider vision, which allowed it to sense danger from far away, and a superpower not even Spider-Man had, the power to glide in the air. She was a tour de force, ready to tackle villains such as Dormammu, Dracula, Steeljaw, and even tasseled with Mr. Fisk himself, aka the Kingpin. The mention of his name could only mean one thing. That's right, even Spider-Man would join her for a team-up. To top it off, she even had a job when she wasn't out fighting crime. Yes, she was a working woman, the editor of Justice magazine no less. Alongside her was her photographer, Jeff Hunt, who feigned being heroic, but truthfully, he was a coward. And with this being a Saturday morning cartoon, you knew some kid or teenager had to be thrown in there for good measure. And that kid was her nephew, Billy. Nevertheless, she went out there and fended off supervillains in service of the city. Despite having ABC's backing, perfectly tailoring the series for the young girl audience, and the inclusion of Spider-Man, it wouldn't spell success for Spider-Woman. The series only got 13 episodes on the network. On top of that, it never even got a rerun season. That was it for our radioactive, arachnid-powered heroine. It may have been for the best, since her popularity had been waning on the comic side by then. Nevertheless, Spider-Woman made history on Saturday mornings. Hopefully, she's still swinging somewhere and battling crime. Go on, wayward heroine. Go on.
Now the secret's just between you and me.
Spider-Woman wouldn't be the only heroine on the network. An unlikely studio decided to take a crack at the genre on Saturday mornings. That studio is none other than Sid and Marty Krofft Productions. That's right, this series was live action. So, what would the studio conjure up for the kids of America on ABC? Well, take a look at this. Lo and behold, Sid and Marty's go at the genre. Electro Woman and Dyna Girl. This one was quite different. Up to this point, the studio was mostly known for puppetry with huge heads and costume creatures and for setting their shows in faraway lands. But here, they played it straight and kept things mostly grounded. The series was about two ladies, Lori and Judy, who worked as reporters for the generically named Newsmaker magazine. But when evil reared its head and with a quick spin of electric charge, Judy and Lori transformed into Electro Woman and Dyna Girl. Lori was played by Deidre Hall. She should be very familiar to those who view daytime television, as she plays the role of Marlena Evans in the long-running soap opera Days of Our Lives. But here, she would be at the height of her career on television, coming off roles on such shows as Emergency. And we have Judy, played by Judy Strangers, who had previously come off her stint on the hit ABC show Room 222. So the studio had two well-established TV actresses portraying our dynamic duo with utmost care. Speaking of a dynamic duo, Electric Woman and Dyna Girl borrowed heavily from 1966's Batman TV series, as it employed the same campiness, tongue-in-cheekness, and most importantly, the cliffhanger format as they contended with the likes of the Pharaoh, Spider Lady, and the Sorcerer. The episodes comprised 12-minute segments. There is something I forgot to clarify. See, Electro Woman and Dyna Girl wasn't a series itself. Truthfully, they were a part of this. Lo and behold, Sid and Marty Krofft's take on the Super Hour Block, a show that came about in collaboration with Ruby and Spears. That's right, teaming up to compete with the live-action offerings that NBC and especially CBS, who previously had Filmation helming several live-action shows exclusively on the network. As for the Krofft Super Show, other segments joined Electro Woman and Dyna Girl, such as The Shrinker. The premise for this segment was about 4 teenagers on an island who were shrunken down to mini-size by a mad scientist and his shrinking ray. They must escape, find a way to get back to their original size, and stop this diabolical scientist from using that ray on the rest of the world. This was as high a concept as the studio had done up to that point. Then we have Wonderbug. This one was their take on Herbie the Love Bug, as it had 3 teenagers driving around a buggy that behaved almost the same way. And lastly, we have The Lost Saucer, which was a rerun of a previous series they had done. The premise of this one had 2 very awkward androids by the name of Fee and Fum that traveled to our time from the year 2369. The series had the star power of its own, with Jim Nabors playing the role of Fum. For those who aren't familiar, he played the role of Gomer Pyle on the 1956 sitcom Gomer Pyle USMC. That character was quite the bumbling type, to say the least. And Fee was played by Ruth Buzzy, who was previously coming off her Golden Globe award-winning stint on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. On top of that, they also played the role of the androids' creators, Dr. Locker and Professor Pringle. The androids were now on a mission to bring back the passengers that boarded their craft, Jerry and Alice, to their own timeline by fixing their year meter. With the reruns of The Lost Saucer and the other segments and the star power behind them, it seemed that the Croft Super Show could stand toe-to-toe with the other networks' live-action offerings. But unfortunately, that stuff didn't matter to kids at home. The show would be retooled in the second season by omitting Electric Woman and Diner Girl and The Lost Saucer. Instead, they would add 2 new segments at the time, Bigfoot and Wild Boy and Magic Mango. Even the show's in-house band, Captain Cool and the Kongs, would be retooled with a new look. But still, unfortunately, this would be the end of the road for the Croft Super Show, as ABC dropped it from their lineup the following season, where it would jump ship to NBC. And that was it for the show. No more.
Why, Frank, you made him funny.
In the latter half of the 1970s, CBS would mostly take a very different approach to Saturday morning programming, with Fred Silverman migrating to ABC and then later to NBC towards the tail end of the decade. CBS appointed a new man to the helm. His name was Lee Curlin. Well, for the first 2 years, until he was succeeded by Robert A. Daly, of course. Competing with the near-constant success that Fred Silverman's output was gaining, CBS had some serious shoes to fill when it came to their Saturday morning lineup. So, with a new head of programming in charge, what would be their initiative going forward? Well, CBS would continue to have animated offerings on the lineup. The Bugs Bunny Roadrunner Hour became a staple on the channel, but that wasn't saying much due to the Looney Tunes shorts being packaged on some time slot on the Big Three in some form or fashion during the 70s. They were bound to appear and return anywhere they pleased. Also, The Alvin Show would make its return to television, and of course, in reruns, but under a different title, Alvin and the Chipmunks. Don't worry, we'll cross that bridge in due time. Filmation would continue to make waves on their network, with a great insurance policy that was either guaranteed to garner a huge audience or fail. This one would be their take on one of the greatest pieces of classic literature. So, what could it have been? Without further ado,
here I was born, and here my parents died when I was but an infant. I would have soon perished too had I not been found by a kindly she-ape named Kala, who adopted me as her own and taught me the ways of the wild. I learned quickly and grew stronger each day.
Here it is,
the vine-swinging man of the wild outdoors, Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. The classic literary masterpiece from Edgar Rice Burroughs. It is a story of a child who was left out in the wild jungle and raised by gorillas. That same child grows up to be the protector of the jungle and its inhabitants from the outsiders of the world. Soon, he falls in love with one of those outsiders, Jane. Together, they face the challenges ahead. That's basically the gist of Edgar Rice Burroughs' tale. But with this offering, Filmation would partially deviate from the source material and put their own stamp on their retelling of Tarzan. First of all, there was no Jane. Instead, Tarzan was joined by a spider monkey companion named Kima, and sometimes by his other animal friends, Tantor the elephant and Jad Balja, a lion. These four got into various adventures that took them into lost cities, ruins, and the like, all while battling the likes of aliens, Vikings, Atlanteans, mole people, and even a robotic version of Tarzan himself at one point in the series. Of course, with this being a Saturday morning cartoon of the time, there was no violence. No weapons were used. Instead, Tarzan always found various ways to ward off his foes. Filmation had showed its evolution as a studio with this outing. Gone were the stock features of their previous offerings. In its place, the studio went with highly detailed characters and backgrounds that truly livened the experience. This was definitely intentional, as Lou Scheimer stated in an interview that he wanted the characters to be lifelike through the use of accurate anatomy, even down to the facial close-ups. This was achieved with the great use of rotoscoping. I can imagine what kids had seen back then as they fully grasped the exploits of our titular hero. The series had become one of Filmation's biggest successes of the late 70s. And of course, this success would warrant them to pair it with something and make their own cartoon hour. But this wouldn't be just some run-of-the-mill throwaway cartoon. See, this cartoon would be none other than the New Adventures of Batman. As discussed in the previous episode, the Adventures of Batman and Robin had become a success for Filmation with its pairing with Superman called the Batman-Superman Hour. The New Adventures of Batman had premiered on the network to moderate success, so for the fall season of 1977, they decided that Tarzan and Batman would make a great duo to win the kids of America over to their side. Even though Batman was back on the network, this wouldn't actually be his first time back. That distinctive honor goes to Super Friends, which was in fact on its latest incarnation, the all-new Super Friends Hour. Batman and Robin were there along for the ride with their other colleagues, but with the New Adventures of Batman, the cartoon definitely had a different approach. First of all, Batman and Robin were voiced by the classic TV actors from the 1966 Batman TV series, Adam West and Burt Ward, respectively. It even retained the same campy catch puns from the TV series as well. Even Batgirl was along for the ride. Their comeback to animation would resemble their previous effort, except for one thing. See, Filmation added another character to the fold to assist Batman and Robin, Batmite, a mascot who provided much needed comedy relief. When he wasn't constantly being a nuisance, that is.
I was only trying to help.
You've helped enough for one day, little fella.
The trio would face off against their usual cast of dastardly villains, such as Clayface, the Penguin, Mr. Freeze, Riddler, and Catwoman, who now sported a very different character design from the one she usually had in the comics. The series even introduced new villains made just for the series, such as Moonman and Sweet Tooth. And of course, there wouldn't be a Batman series without his greatest adversary,
the Joker. It seemed the mashup would guarantee instant success for the network, but that wasn't entirely the case. The pair-up of Batman and Tarzan only lasted for that season, but Filmation wasn't done by pairing Tarzan with something else. They knew they had something great in Tarzan, so they decided that pairing something equally great would work wonders. This time, it would be a return of sorts, another shot at superheroics, Filmation style. Lo and behold, the Freedom Force. Here, we have a superhero team that banded together to face the evils of the world and galaxy. The Freedom Force appeared as a part of a 90-minute block of cartoons. The team consisted of Super Samurai, a boy who was endowed with the power of a giant samurai when his name was called upon. Then you had Merlin, a master of the magical arts, and Sinbad, the greatest hero that ever sailed the seas. Remember when I said that a hero went off and joined another team on adventures on another network? Well, here he is, Hercules, here to lend a hand against the forces of evil. And lastly, their leader, coming off her stint as a live-action heroine, makes her debut in animated form. Of course, I speak of Isis. Wait, let me reiterate. See, even though there were the Freedom Force segments, other segments actually comprised this iteration. The Super 7 would actually be a series of cartoons that focused on 3 superpowered duos that ran concurrently. First up, we have Super Stretch and Micro Woman. This would be the studio's other attempt at representation, as they doubled down with 2 African-American superheroes this time. And they were a married couple. Criss Cross, the scientist, became Super Stretch. As his superhero name implies, he had the power to stretch himself for long lengths and into any shape that he could muster. And his wife, Christy, who went into action as Micro Woman. She had the power to shrink down to a mini scale and rode on a pet dog, Trouble, as they went around fighting crime. And then there was Manta and Moray, the denizens of Atlantis, who fought against the evils of the 7 seas and beyond. And lastly, there was Web Woman, who had the power to control all insects at her whim, a cosmic power that is given to her by an alien named Scarab. She used it for the greater good, alongside her companion, Spinner. If these characters look familiar in some way, you wouldn't be the only ones. DC Comics also thought the same, as they had taken Filmation to court over its carbon copies of Aquaman and Plastic Man with Manta and Moray and Super Stretch respectively. This was quite jarring considering that they had started out producing a DC Comics property in the first place, including at one time making Aquaman segments themselves 10 years prior. To make a long story short, Filmation had lost the case, and that alone spelled doom for the Super 7. There's definitely a more to the story. I will let you figure that out. In all, Tarzan and the Super 7 wasn't the ticket that kept Filmation's creations striving on the network. That was it for our super team of heroes. They were gone from the lineup. As for Tarzan, it wouldn't be the end of him just yet. Nothing could keep the Lord of the Jungle down for too long. At least for the time being. Filmation wasn't done just yet. They also had another cartoon up its sleeves for 1979. This one would conjure up the remnants of the past, a character that once had a great place amongst the pantheon of cartoon characters. So, what was it? Well, without further ado,
fastest mouse in the universe, Mighty Mouse.
Yes, that superheroic rodent was back and ready to save the day in the new adventures of Mighty Mouse. Not only that, Heckle and Jekyll were along for the ride as well. It would be quite some time since their last outing on the network, with the grouping of their original animated shorts with the Mighty Mouse Playhouse, 1967 to be exact. During the latter half of the decade, the shorts were having great success in syndication, so it was written in the stars for our super rodent to make his return to Saturday mornings in new adventures. Considering that CBS once owned the shorts to begin with, and their great relationship with Filmation, who gave them their very first superhero cartoon, The New Adventures of Superman, and the very successful Archie show and its various incarnations, this was a match made in the stars. Filmation's new take on Mighty Mouse still had our superheroic rodent out saving the day and rescuing Polly Pureheart from the dastardly clutches of Oil Can Harry and his henchman Swifty. But now, the constant singing in the shorts was mostly omitted from this iteration. Also, the cartoon would feature Mighty Mouse in a brand new adventure called The Great Space Chase. These were serialized segments that formed one singular story. This time, Mighty Mouse had fully taken into venturing into space, instead of just peering down to Earth through his microscope when he was in need. It was basically a variation of the Mighty Mouse segments that had him battling a dastardly villain by the name of Harry Heartless, a variation of Oil Can Harry, and of course, rescuing Queen Pearl Pureheart in the process. Good old Mighty Mouse, saving the day even in outer space. Then you had Heckle and Jekyll, our two mischievous magpies, who were mostly the same from the shorts, except, of course, their antics being toned down for the television viewing audience. Besides breaking the fourth wall for comedic purposes, they also found time in between the show to teach the young audience the use of homonyms. And Mighty Mouse imparted knowledge about environmental conservation with his environmental bulletins. This was the studio's attempt to make the character more kid-friendly in the eyes of parents that mostly disapproved of the original shorts antics as standard Saturday morning cartoon fare. On top of those, Filmation would create a new character for this series, Quackula. This segment had a vampire duck who lived in a castle that belonged to a bear by the name of Theodore. Get it? His name was Teddy Bear. Okay. Nevertheless, Quackula attempted to terrify the town's citizens, but his attempts were not to his advantage. And so was Theodore's attempts to evict him from his castle. Rent issues, darn it.
My house!
And you know what else had failed? Filmation's attempt at creating an original character. See, the studio would once again be in hot waters as they were sued by Scott Shaw over Filmation copying his character, Duckula, that appeared in the first issue of a comic named Quack 2 years prior. But Filmation didn't think so, as they claimed that they actually got the idea for the character from a Gold Key, published Daffy Duck comic book that also featured a character named Count Duckula. So that would have been enough to get Filmation out of the water, right? Well, that wasn't the case. Supposedly during the creation of Quackula, animes at the studio had copies of that Daffy Duck comic laying around to draw reference. And that issue of Quack as well. Yeah. Guess what happened next? Well, Filmation settled out of court, and the character was removed from reruns of the series. Definitely wasn't a good look for the studio. Speaking of reruns, the New Adventures of Mighty Mouse would air for 3 years on the network, despite only having 13 episodes ever made. But that wouldn't be it for our superheroic rodent yet, as we will see later on. For now, the children of America would have to wait until his return to save the day once more. Fly upward, O mighty one.
my hero!
The 70s had come to an end, and the networks were in dire straits with the advertisers and watchdog groups. With the ACT still applying pressure on the advertisers to loosen their grip on advertising their products to children, the networks were just running with anything they could find and bring to air. The constant reshuffling of shows and repackaging of older shows into hour-long blocks started to make the networks become disenfranchised with Saturday mornings altogether. Also, by 1978, many studios started to feel the same as they employed a practice that was hurting animators across the board: outsourcing, or more precisely called runaway productions. When I mean studios, this was mostly extended to Disney and Hanna-Barbera. But little did they know that this practice would change the state of Saturday morning cartoons going forward. As we jump into the 1980s, things will start to change for the worse and reach its boiling point before it fully evolves into its second boom. With that said,